The weight that changed everything. She stood in the corner of her home gym, staring at the pair of adjustable dumbbells like they held some secret she couldn't decode. They looked simple enough: twist the dial, lift the weight. But every time she reached for them, something felt off, like she was missing a language everyone else seemed to speak fluently. Most of us buy equipment thinking it'll solve the problem. The right tool equals the right result. But what she was learning, slowly and painfully, was that the tool was never the issue. It was how she spoke to it, how she listened, how she let it become part of her rhythm instead of fighting against it. She had tried everything: online programs, early morning discipline, late-night motivation videos. And still, the weights sat there, collecting dust between bursts of ambition. Part of her wondered if she was broken in some way, if consistency was a gift some people had and others just pretended to understand. But what happened next changed everything. It started with a small shift. She stopped trying to do what everyone else was doing, stopped chasing the Instagram workouts that looked perfect under ring lights. Instead, she asked herself a question she'd been avoiding for months. What if the problem wasn't her effort, but her approach? She began experimenting, not with complicated routines, but with how she held the dumbbells, where she placed her feet, how she breathed between reps. Tiny adjustments that felt almost embarrassing in their simplicity. But somewhere in those micro changes, something clicked. Researchers at the Human Performance Lab have found something fascinating. Motor learning isn't just about repetition, it's about variability within structure. When we adjust small variables while maintaining core patterns, our nervous system adapts faster. We don't just build muscle, we build intelligence into movement itself. She didn't know the science then. She just knew that when she stopped gripping the dumbbells like they might escape, when she let her wrists find their natural angle, when she focused on the feel rather than the finish, everything got easier. Not in an instant, not like a revelation, but like a door slowly opening to a room she'd been standing outside of for years. What would you do in that moment? When you realize the thing you've been fighting might actually be trying to help you. She started keeping a notebook, not for tracking weight or reps, but for tracking feeling. Today, my shoulders felt tight. This grip made my wrists hurt. When I slowed down the descent, I felt muscles I didn't know existed. It became less about performance and more about conversation. Her body was speaking, she was finally learning to listen, but there was still one thing she couldn't explain. Some days, no matter how well she executed the movement, something felt unstable. The weight would shift awkwardly mid-press. Her balance would teeter during lunges. She thought maybe it was her form, her core strength, her focus. She filmed herself, adjusted her stance, tried again. The instability remained. Then came the realization that felt almost too obvious to be true. She checked the dial on her dumbbells. Not just glanced at it, actually tested it. Twisted it, pulled it, felt for the click that should lock the plates in place. On her right dumbbell, the mechanism was slightly loose. Not broken, just loose enough that under load plates could shift a millimeter or two. Barely noticeable visually, completely transformative physically. She tightened it. The next workout, the instability vanished. Sometimes we only understand precision when we've lived in its absence. This is where most people stop. Problem solved, move on. But she kept digging. If something that small could change everything, what else was she missing? She started studying the geometry of her equipment, how the weight distribution shifted depending on grip width, how rotating her palm angle by 15 degrees could move tension from her bicep to her forearm, how the speed of her movement determined which muscle fibers fired. She wasn't becoming obsessed, she was becoming fluent. What surprised her most wasn't just how understanding the mechanics improved her workouts, but how everything started to feel different once she stopped rushing through movements. She wasn't expecting such a clear change, and honestly, she tested different approaches more than a few times before she figured out what really worked. This isn't a promotion, just sharing real results that made a noticeable difference for her experience with adjustable dumbbells. Part of her still doubted it could work long-term. Motivation fades, enthusiasm plateaus. What happens when the novelty wears off and you're left with just the weight and the choice? She'd been here before. The initial spark that dims into background noise, the equipment that becomes invisible furniture. She knew this pattern intimately, but something was different this time. She wasn't relying on excitement, she was relying on curiosity. Every session became an experiment. What happens if I pause at the bottom? What if I change the tempo? What if I add a slight rotation? The weight never changed, but the questions did. And questions, she learned, are renewable fuel. She laughed one morning, realizing progress didn't always look like progress. Some weeks she lifted heavier, other weeks she focused on control with lighter loads. Some days she did 5 exercises, other days just 2 done perfectly. The scale didn't always move, her reflection didn't dramatically transform, but her relationship with movement did, and that quietly was the revolution she'd been searching for. Neuroscientists studying habit formation have discovered something most fitness culture ignores. Sustainable behavior change doesn't come from intensity. It comes from identity shift. When we stop seeing ourselves as people trying to work out and start seeing ourselves as people who move with intention, the effort transforms from obligation to expression. She thought she was chasing strength. What she found was conversation. Then came the injury and the real test. Not dramatic, not emergency room serious, just a dull ache in her left shoulder that wouldn't leave, the kind that whispers warnings during overhead presses. That makes you wonder if pushing through is courage or stupidity. She'd ignored signals before, pushed until something broke. This time she listened. She modified everything, reduced the range, changed the angle, focused on the muscles she could work without aggravating what hurt. And in that limitation, she found creativity. Suddenly, adjustable dumbbells weren't just for the standard 8 exercises. They became tools for movement exploration, floor presses, single arm carries, rotational work, isometric holds. The injury forced innovation. What would you do when the path you planned becomes impossible? She worked around the pain for 3 weeks, then 4. Slowly, carefully, she reintroduced movement into the shoulder. Not the old patterns, new ones, built on caution and respect. The shoulder healed, but more importantly, she learned that adaptation wasn't failure, it was sophistication. Maybe she was chasing the wrong goal all along. Fitness culture sells transformation, before and after, weak to strong, invisible to visible. But sitting there on her gym floor between sets, catching her breath, she realized transformation wasn't the point. Being was the point. The mornings she showed up tired, the sessions that felt mediocre, the days she only did 15 minutes because 15 was what she had. Those moments weren't failures, they were the actual practice. The dumbbells became witnesses to her frustration, her growth, her stubbornness, her grace. They didn't judge the days she lifted light or the weeks she skipped entirely. They just waited, ready whenever she was ready. Somewhere between the failures and the quiet mornings, she found rhythm and peace. She started noticing other things, how her grip strength improved enough that opening jars became effortless, how carrying groceries felt lighter, how her posture shifted without her trying to correct it. The benefits weren't just in the gym, they bled into her life like ink spreading through water. Subtle, pervasive, undeniable. She thought about the version of herself who first bought those dumbbells, full of hope and intimidation, expecting them to be magic, disappointed when they weren't. If she could talk to that version now, she'd say something simple. The magic isn't in the equipment. It's in the willingness to stay curious when it gets hard. But what happens when curiosity runs dry? When you've explored the movements, understood the mechanics, built the habits, and still, one morning, you just don't care. She hit that wall around month 7. Not burned out, not injured, just flat. The dumbbells felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. She took 3 days off, not as punishment or failure, but as information. When she came back, she didn't push, she played, put on music she loved, tried movements that felt good instead of productive, laughed at her own clumsiness. That session, she lifted less than she had in months, and it was the best workout she'd had in weeks. Sometimes we only understand commitment when we give ourselves permission to pause. She realized something profound in that moment. Discipline isn't about never stopping. It's about always returning. The comeback is the practice, not the perfect streak, not the unbroken chain. The willingness to come back after breaking. That's where real strength lives. She started sharing her experience with friends, not as advice, but as story. One friend tried adjustable dumbbells for the first time and called her frustrated. "I don't get it. They feel awkward." She smiled, remembering. "Give it time," she said. "You're not learning the dumbbells. You're learning yourself with the dumbbells. That takes longer." When she looked in the mirror again, it wasn't her reflection that had changed. It was what she believed about herself. She wasn't stronger because she could lift more. She was stronger because she could listen better, adjust better, return better. The dumbbells were never the destination. They were the question. And she was still discovering answers. The weight that changed everything wasn't measured in pounds. It was measured in patience, in curiosity, in the quiet confidence that comes from showing up for yourself even when no one's watching, especially then. Tell us what part of this story resonated most and where you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.